Hello, greetings from London, sunny London, and the Centre for Universal Health at Chatham House. My name's Rob Yates. I'm the Executive Director of the Centre, and we specialise in issues relating to the political economy of health and health reforms. We're absolutely delighted to be partnering again with MSD in this event, which is part of London Global Cancer Week. And again, we've been thrilled to have been part of the third London Global Cancer Week and see this event grow from year to year. We have already had a couple of roundtable events that have been held under the famous Chatham House rule, where we as a group came together to discuss things in private, particularly looking at issues around cancer screening and specifically lung cancer screening and the importance of early interventions, early treatment in tackling cancer. But we thought that we would also very keen to sort of bring people who are involved in those events to participate in a public event where we can talk openly about these very, very important issues and how they relate to cancer services, non-communicable diseases, and the broader picture of universal health coverage. As I say, this is a public event, it's on the record, and in fact, we very much encourage you to spread the word. We'd be delighted were you to take screenshots and tweet and spread the message around as much as possible. So please do sort of join in the attempts to promote this very important cause. We are also hoping that it is going to be very participative, and we would like you to be thinking of questions for our eminent panel on the topic of screening and early interventions in treating cancer. And we'd like you to use the Q&A function for that, please. You'll find as audience members, you won't be able to use the chat function, but if you put your questions in Q&A, they'll be fed through to me and I'll be able to see the questions. And if you see a question that you particularly like that someone's asked, if you can sort of give it the thumbs up, if you click on the little thumb, that will promote that question up the list and we'll try and ask the more popular questions. And in fact, we'd be absolutely delighted, if you fancy it, to come on air, as it were, and join us and pose your question, and we'll ask you to unmute and ask a question. If you're not comfortable in doing that, don't worry, because I'll ask the question on your behalf. So, as I mentioned, that we've got an eminent panel with us today to discuss these very important topics, and I'll just very briefly introduce them. I hope you don't mind very sort of short bios, in fact, just job titles, because we've only got an hour for this session. So we have with us today Andre Ilbawi, who is a medical officer in the Cancer Control Unit and Department of Non-Communicable Diseases at the World Health Organization. David Taylor, who is a professor at School of Pharmacy at University College London. Thank you, David. Christina Sitt, who is the Director of Programs and Stakeholder Relations at Lung Cancer Canada. And Ruma Bhargava, who is the lead advisor on healthcare for the World Economic Forum and is joining us from Northern India today. So we're absolutely thrilled to have you with us today. And as I say, we're very keen that our session is a dialogue, really, rather than sort of giving presentations. But I was wondering if you could sort of perhaps give us your top line reflections on the discussions that we've been having around the importance of screening and early cancer interventions. You'll recognise that our previous meetings were held under the Chatham House rules, so please don't attribute anything to anything anyone said. But it is, you know, sort of quite legitimate to say, well, what were your take-home messages overall from those sessions? And maybe, Andre, if I could kick off with you. So, Andre, what were your sort of big take-home messages around the importance of screening and early interventions?
Thanks so much, Robin. Really, also, it's a good opportunity to pause and thank you and the Chatham House for such a fruitful discussion. The roundtables were very rich, very dynamic, and what was most important was that we saw representatives across different sectors involved. But there are three messages that I think really can the audience into that dialogue in a meaningful way. The first is political will. Look, let's be honest, political will is a catchphrase that we hear in nearly every meeting, every roundtable. But I do think that the group went one step further. What was interesting is how we looked at what factors undermine political will in cancer. What we saw was this vicious cycle of inadequate investments, insufficient impact, weak demand, loss of trust in the health system. These were the types of parameters that really undermine the political will that we need in cancer. So there's strong consensus that for us to change this, we need a bit more of a social movement. We've seen it in some high-income countries, select cancers, select dimensions, but really we need a global social movement to personalize the cancer agenda, to focus it really on how do we prioritize quality value-based services that then can trigger greater investments. I think the second dimension then is to think about, as you have highlighted many times before, the importance of UHC. Not only UHC, but to bring in the dimension of progressive realization, that we have to go in a stepwise manner, focusing on the dynamics of giving care to the most vulnerable and advocating for equity. These dimensions really can't be forgotten in the UHC agenda and really should be part and parcel of how we see cancer in that UHC agenda. As a simple reference, many of us know very well, but screening can't have value if treatment is not available, simply said. The same is true for advanced therapies and diagnostics. So UHC really is for us something we really need to bring the community together around and to use the type of language that resonates in the broader health and economic space. And then finally, capacity building and partnerships. Look, in cancer, we are benefited by this rich, diverse set of partners and stakeholders. But for many years, we've been going at it a bit alone or a bit in a fragmented way. There is time now for us to come together around a common agenda, and UHC does provide that. We have seen some successes in childhood cancer. There's been a lot of recent movement and coalescing of stakeholders. But for us to succeed in the broader cancer agenda, we really need to come and realize that everyone needs an equal footing and really rotate it around the people living with the disease. So those were the big three take-home messages for me. Thanks, Rob.
Brilliant. That's perfect introduction. And I'm delighted you referenced the importance of political will and raising political will, because you're absolutely right. I think sort of coming out of this COVID crisis, there's going to be a real scrap, to get resources for health and, competing against other sectors. And it's all about sort of getting the attention right to the top of government. Ruma, what were your reflections? Sort of what do you think? Perhaps even from the perspective where you are in India, sort of around these issues.
Right. First of all, thank you, Rob, for giving this opportunity to share the views. Seconding Andre's thought on the importance of prevention and the factors which affect it, I would like to focus my thoughts on what can be done to enhance early detection and early treatment in low resource setting, especially as we already knew before, but what COVID has exposed further is our beleaguered healthcare systems, skewed manpower, underfunded infrastructures and healthcare systems. So I feel technology would be playing a very key role, not only in the health constrained systems, but across populations, be it in the developing or the developed worlds, and more so the fourth industrial revolution technologies. I work very closely with those, and cancer is the project what we are working on. So artificial intelligence, IoT, blockchain, those are the ones which which we could leverage. And especially like 3 points I would like to mention as to how artificial intelligence can be used for early detection. Firstly, in image analysis, if we talk about convoluted neural networks, how pixel level image analysis can be leveraged not only in the detection of lung cancer, but also if we talk about biopsies, cervical cancer as well. Talking about early treatment, how technology can be leveraged is that based on the health records and the patient level data, we can form individualized treatment plan for the patient. And also the same can be leveraged in drug discovery. AI can be used in clinical trials. This would not only like bring down the cost, which is incurred during these large clinical trials, but also significantly reduce the time because the human interface as it comes, it takes a lot of time to interpret the data. So I feel that with respect to the other factors, not only the other factors are needed like the political will, funding, capacity building, but also in the times of globalization where we live, technology is the important lever which will prove to be a game changer if we talk about universal health coverage. Because as I mentioned during in my early comments, that the gaps what we have with respect to human resources, with respect to funding, with respect to capacity building, technology would be the foremost factor which could connect all these dots and help us in achieving universal health coverage.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ruma. So very much emphasizing the importance of sort of new technologies and improving efficiency and extending coverage. And I think you are seeing definitely so many health systems having been shocked through the crisis and experimenting with new technologies. And I think a lot of people recognizing that we're not going back to what we had before. And therefore, many respects, is proving a great opportunity to completely reform health sectors. David, what are your thoughts about the importance of sort of screening and early treatments?
Well, thank you, Rob. First, thoughts that obviously coping with cancer, we've made some progress in the last 50 years. There's a long way to go. COVID's made it more difficult. People are trying desperately hard, and in trying to improve things, we mustn't neglect the huge effort everybody's making. Secondly, we do have big problems across the board. In the UK, our waiting times are longer than they've been recorded for decades. And we've got issues like, for example, the failures, in my view, to move forward fast enough with lung cancer screening, etc. Not enough focus on early diagnosis generally. Why? And why the problems with political will? Well, essentially, we're short-term creatures. We evolved to deal with immediate threats. We discount the future, which is fine as individuals, but collectively, it's a big mistake. And so we need to get more long-term focus, focused on the good of the collective rather than just individual health, which leads you back both to political will and universal healthcare. How do we do that? Well, it's partly through political argument, but also holding people to their promises. In the UK, the last budget said we should have better primary care diagnosis. We must invest in community diagnostic hubs, as they're called. Well, we must hold each other to the promise and be willing to pay the taxes. But that's a long-term political debate. I'd only finish off by saying, people say, my goodness, look at COVID, look at the state of the British economy after Brexit. Can we afford this? My view is we can't afford not to invest in the biological sciences generally. There's a case for saying, quite a strong one, we underinvest in cancer. But in long-term bioscientific research, if humanity is going to survive this century, it's something we collectively can't afford not to do. And as well as for the UK economy and countries like us, if we can't earn our living through scientific endeavour, we very probably can't earn our living.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David. And I think you're absolutely right about almost the inevitability that societies are going to spend more on health and healthcare as they age and the burden of diseases changes. Very strong economic proof that that is the nature of health. That weirdly, it's actually a luxury good. As people get richer, they spend more money on it. And so very important this is communicated to our political leaders that there is this inevitability, and that public financing will be sort of one of the cheapest and equitable ways to spend that money. Christina, that's from Canada. Thank you so much for getting up early to join us. What are your thoughts?
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to Chatham House, and thank you everyone for joining and joining us today. I want to start my remarks by telling you about my friend Lloyd and Lauren. Lloyd and Lauren are biological twins that live in rural Alberta. So if you know anything about Canada, Canada is a very big country with lots of rural areas and people clustered around cities as well. So Lauren went in with his brother Lloyd to his oncology appointment because Lloyd was diagnosed with stage 1 lung cancer. Lauren thought, we're biological twins. I'm just going to go with you to get to this appointment because, maybe I have lung cancer too. Not really thinking that he had lung cancer, more acting as a support for his brother. But, it turned out that Lauren had stage 4 lung cancer. So it's unconscionable in this day and age that we are relying on screening for cancer by twin. If not impractical, because most of us don't have biological twins. But, having said that, Lauren qualifies for lung cancer screening. He smoked most of his life, and he still smokes today. But if you ask him, Lauren, would you have gone for lung cancer screening? He may have said, well, maybe not. When you ask him why, Lauren would have had to travel a couple of hours to go get screened. He would have said, I was too busy making a living for my family, too busy taking care of my grandchildren. So one of the takeaways here that from the the tables is healthcare has to be gotten to the people. People can't be expected to travel long distances to healthcare. We must be getting health to people. And that, having said that, the logistics of healthcare is equally important to the treatment efficacy. So when we're planning healthcare, we have to think about how are people accessing it? Who are the influencers? Is it that we need to talk? Was it Lauren's wife, Mary, that we needed to talk to and we needed to get to? Or in some cases, is that we need to take the women away from their husbands and be in places like the marketplaces so that we can deliver these healthcare messages. Where does healthcare need to be? And it needs to be where the people are. And then the third is really talking about, and really that second part talked about personal will, but the third talks about the point that Andre made, and is that we cannot separate the treatments from the cancer detection.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, that was definitely one of the key topics that we were discussing. In fact, that you actually lead in perfectly, Christine. The first question I was going to pose to Andre, actually, sort of sitting there in WHO in the Cancer Control Program. And that's really, Andre, about, the sort of the differences between cancer prevention and screening, sort of audience members might sort of be confused about what the differences are and how do they sort of relate into the spectrum of cancer services. You mentioned the importance of universal health coverage, right, from promotion and, that's also palliative care in some instances. But how do you sort of see cancer prevention and screening fitting into that spectrum?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rob. This is an important starting point because one important principle is that we shouldn't, this is also something that you've also raised many times, we can't compete between diseases and we can't compete within the cancer agenda. Prevention and early detection have their merits. And the suggestion that we need to have one or the other is really not an important, not a appropriate starting point for a discussion. So what are some of the distinctions? As a point of justification, we all know that most healthcare resources are focused on early detection and treatment. Now, that may be for a variety of reasons. In fact, in cancer, it may be 90% or more. That doesn't mean that we need to shift that percentage. That's a topic for perhaps a more in-depth dialogue. What is really important here is to see how each have their merits. When we talk about cancer prevention, many of us focus on important risk factors: tobacco, alcohol, physical inactivity. But it's also worthwhile for us to see cancer again in the broader context of our societies. And I think David said this so importantly. That when we actually look at what are the primary drivers of premature mortality reduction in cancer over the past 20 years, in fact, reductions in gastric cancer mortality are the reason that many high-income countries are seeing them work towards the SDG target. These were 20, 30, 40-year-old investments in water sanitation, reducing H. pylori, reducing gastric mortality, ultimately reducing premature mortality from cancer. A huge achievement. Now, we have to acknowledge that it's not just prevention. When we look at that same set of parameters, why are high-income countries, why are the high-performing countries excelling in premature mortality reduction? We see early detection as a second parameter. Now, when we talk about early detection, it is important to realize the distinction: screening and early diagnosis. Screening is when we have population-based programs, when we reach out to a community without symptoms and say, is it possible you have cancer or you are at risk of cancer? Mm-hmm. While that is incredibly important in some cancers, cervical cancer, colorectal cancer, breast, lung now is an emerging technology as well, it is only 5% of how cancers are detected in a country like the United Kingdom. So screening is important. Let's focus on it. As we heard also from the esteemed panel, we need to think about the technologies. I think what we heard from our colleague at WEF was very well said. When we look at what cancer will look like in 30 years, it will be totally different from our understanding of cancer today. In the interim, let's also focus on that early diagnosis. As we heard, get into the community. What does early diagnosis mean? Be aware of the symptoms, get diagnosed quickly, and initiate treatment in the most timely way. A delay of more than 60 days in breast cancer can increase your mortality 3%, 5%, 10%. So we need to really get into that message that prevention is important. Let's reduce the overall deaths and disability from cancer. Let's focus on population level interventions that work, tobacco control, physical activity. But let's also think about early detection as a group. And when we think about it as a group, let's invest in new technologies for screening. But at the same time, let's remember that most lives will be saved because we diagnose cancer early. Maybe I can close with two important examples that we see from middle income countries. One is in Thailand, UHC, again, as a guiding principle. Thailand did a nice analysis in oral cancer outcomes before and after they introduced UHC. We weren't sure what to expect. Maybe they would have better stage-specific survival. In fact, the reason they had better overall impact and outcomes was because people came earlier. They said, if the service is there, I will come. So it's not that treatment became better, more complete, more coherent, more evidence-based. In fact, the only thing that really happened, people said, you're going to offer the service to me for free? Now I'm going to come. Second example, in South Africa, they put up a sign outside a hospital that said breast clinic. That's it. They saw a stage shift. If we build it, people will come. So build it, finance it, offer it in quality, keep it close to home, and that's how we can improve cancer outcomes. Prevent, yes, we must. Let's also focus on early detection and treatment.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andre. As you know, that I'm passionate about publicly financed free universal health coverage, and it's often difficult to prove the impact on that on health outcomes. So I'd love to hear more about that story from Thailand. So please, could you send me all that information?
Absolutely,
because this is very good evidence. And there are absolute access barriers, sort of making services free. It's a scary thing thinking that you might have something that needs diagnosing like that. And even just a small user charge or co-payment can be just the thing that stops people coming, and how important these things are. And Christina, maybe if I can switch back to you actually, sort of to talk about the role of patients and because again, it was very much one of the topics coming out of our discussions, the importance of engaging patients and patient advocates in promoting for early care interventions. So what do you think are the roles of engaging the community and patients in these processes?
Patients and patient groups. I think if we have to answer this question, we really need to look at the traditional way that health has been costed. Healthcare in countries such as Canada is really a cost center. Right? There's a certain budget, and there's a certain budget for treatments, and everything is weighted against a value when it comes to health technology assessment, and what is the value of the healthcare and whether or not it would be funded. And where patients and patient groups really play a role is taking the value of the treatment beyond just the cost of the treatment itself, and really showing and advocating for the fact that there is value beyond just the cost. For example, what is the things that we are not measuring? What is the value of independence of the patient? When patients take a particular treatment and they don't need their healthcare caregiver to really take the day off of work or take leave. What is that value? What is the value when they're able to go back to work? That value, and they become contributing tax members. What is that particular value? And what is the value of mental health? Of improving the hopes and outlooks of their life? What is the value of having of the entire of the mental state of the entire family? So patients and caregivers can really advocate for these sort of values that are not measured in clinical trials, and to really show health technology assessments agencies as well as government that these measures should be included and are real.
Thank you very much. And I know that WHO is doing a lot of work on this, looking at the economics of health for all, and exactly as you're saying, reevaluating how we value good health and healthcare and what it means to societies. And in many respects, recognizing that we've been spectacularly undervaluing this and almost flipping the argument on its head to say, instead of investing in health, what can it do for economies? It's sort of, how economies can improve people's health and well-being. So I know WHO is doing a lot of work on this. And this perhaps sort of takes us into the domain of the economics and the financing. And David, you've already alluded to some of this. So if I can sort of maybe ask you about the drivers that you think have been influencing funding for screening and early stage cancer care. You've already indicated that there's perhaps been an underinvestment here. What's your view as to why that's been the case and how that might be turned around?
Well, lots of possible reasons, Rob, but you support universal health care and tax funded care, and that's very sensible. There are dangers in it. That if we don't like paying taxes, and most of us don't, and government politicians want to be re-elected, you nationalize a thing because it's so important, but then you tend to curb the expenditure. It may be that you do universal healthcare more equitably than private systems, but there is the danger of underspending and there's the danger of tricks. For example, in the UK, what we've done is to be quite generous, apparently, with the current expenditure, but we've underinvested on the capital budget in things like radiology. We've underinvested in training, so we haven't got the people to do things, which especially with if you reduce the movement of people, gives us big problems. So look at government motivation. Be careful of divide and rule tactics, and you referenced WHO. I worry sometimes that while supporting prevention, for me it's a tragedy that even in the rich world, 20% of us, 25% of us on average still smoke. In the poor world, it pushes up 30, 40% even. I can see Andrea nodding. That's an appalling tragedy, although it wasn't until I had cancer myself, I didn't realize how talk about prevention can sound so threatening. It sounds as if you're almost writing off sometimes the people who've got it. And early detection is no guarantee of effective treatment at the moment. Do I want to see continued investment in high tech, in understanding the detailed molecular nature of cancer and getting sophisticated treatments? Yes, I do. They may not sound cost effective compared with stopping people smoking, but they're part and parcel of a whole. And if we want population commitment to screening, and we could talk about, do we mean selective screening? Do we look especially at smokers, for example? I think in the past, some epidemiologists and public health experts have had problems with the concept of selective screening. We want people to be involved, but if they don't believe we're investing in treatment, if they don't believe that they've got advanced disease, they're going to be treated well, they're going to be deeply discouraged. So I think it's defending the whole, not just not stealing from other disease categories like cardiovascular disease, but also recognizing the value of expensive high-end research alongside the value of broad, low-cost public health systems.
Sorry, I managed to mute myself there. Thank you very much indeed, David. And these are all hot topics that so many countries are debating at the moment. I mean, it's for a UK audience, you'll be aware that the BBC are running a series this week about the NHS, how it's coping, its need for more monies and where those monies should be invested. And obviously in the UK, these issues are highly politicized. And I think in many respects, that's a very good thing, because it's only when sort of political pressure is sort of applied that leaders recognize the importance of doing these investments. So Ruma, if I can sort of come to you, but perhaps before I do come to Ruma, just to remind our audience that we're sort of taking questions. And in fact, what I'm planning to do is to just ask one more question to Ruma now, but then go straight to the audience. I know how frustrating it can be to join these events and the Q&A gets squeezed the last 5 minutes. I have got another round of questions I'm dying to ask, but instead, in the interest of democracy, I'm more than happy to bring in the audience next. And in fact, I can see an audience member being lined up for that. So please do ask away with your questions in the Q&A. So Ruma, if I might sort of come to you, and building on what David said, where do you think that budgets for existing prevention services can be amended to include early interventions for cancer care? And are there, lessons from existing funding mechanisms for adoption of health services that other countries can consider, particularly thinking of low-income settings?
Right. Thanks, Rob, for that question. And in my opinion, I would say that dovetailing the budgets to address the prevention for the spectrum of whole of the non-communicable diseases, be it cancer, cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, or stroke, that would help reduce this deficit of funding, especially for the prevention of cancer. Why I say this is that this would not only ensure that we have lower budgets, because the budgets for prevention are combined for the spectrum of diseases, but also the prevalence of all the NCDs is directly proportional to increasing ages, lifestyle changes, and also the behavioral risk factors like tobacco use, alcohol consumption, unhealthy diets. They are same across NCDs. So with just one approach, we would be targeting a spectrum of diseases. That is what I would say. Also, I would say that addressing these factors would require interventions from sectors beyond health. So it should be a coordinated multi-stakeholder engagement, which is needed. And hence, there is also a need of a multi-sectoral action plan. And I would like to quote the example of India's National Cancer Care Program, which has now been rechristened into National Program for Prevention and Control of Cancer, Diabetes, Cardiovascular Diseases, and Stroke. So here in this particular National Health Program, what is happening is that the frontline health workers, they are being given training for early detection and screening of all these diseases with the backing of technology. So the whole of the spectrum, right from diagnosis to the treatment of the patient, is digitized. Not only the frontline health worker gets the training in all of the non-communicable diseases, it is also beneficial for the population that they are being screened not only for one disease, but for all the diseases. So that is like one approach I would like to suggest for the budgets, which could add up for that. Then we could also say that the framework of implementation, when we talk about for the National Cancer Care Program, it should take into account the realistic timelines, mechanisms, and what is the role of the particular stakeholder. That how is each particular stakeholder accountable for every step of the program, and what is the budget each should be accountable for. Not only this, now we have in India and South Asia have seen corporate social responsibility is one of the major drivers, which is not only funding the private sector, but also the various government sector programs. In India, it's a law that every company which has a significant amount of profit, that is 2.5 million INR, would be giving 2.5% of their net worth for charity or for government projects. That's one. Then we can also focus not only on the donors and development partner funds, but also the sin tax, like what we call increasing the tax on consumption of alcohol, on tobacco cessation, and all the junk foods. So those would be like some of the recommendations from my side as to how we can increase budget for health promotion and early detection.
Fantastic, thanks very much. And there's a wonderful example of that last point you made there from Thailand, isn't there? The whole health promotion unit is funded basically out of tobacco taxes, and so that's sort of a very effective way of sort of not only sort of reducing demand for things that sort of cause ill health, but then using those funds very imaginatively. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. And I'd like to sort of bring in the audience now, and I can see that we've got Mark Wilson awaiting patiently. He asked the first question, so I'll definitely give him the opportunity to pose his question. Mark, would you like to sort of come on mic and put your question to the panel? I'm not sure if you're directing it specifically at one panel member, and if you can just very briefly say where you're from. You know, if you're from an organisation, or perhaps you're not, but if you can just sort of give us a bit of background about yourself.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm Mark Wilson. I ought to state straight away that I've just left Cochrane after 9 years as Cochrane's CEO. So that's very much the foundation of my question, which is to the whole panel. I was delighted to hear Andre's comments in particular, but I wanted to get the reaction, because I don't know obviously what conversations have been had in recent days. But Cochrane's synthesized evidence across different types of cancer shows that screening across different kinds is either unproven or ineffective, and unproven in many respects because of insufficient RCTs or other trial or quality evidence. So as we have to ensure, as you've been stating quite clearly and effectively, that we need to make cost-effective interventions, what does the panel think about this, particularly in relation to the screening challenge? And are clinicians concentrating too much on screening rather than, as Andre was indicating, other forms of prevention and early and effective diagnosis and response?
Fantastic question, Mark. Thank you so much. And this did come up in our discussions, you know, sort of particularly with representatives from some low middle income countries who very much felt, you know, that a big focus on screening wouldn't be appropriate for them at the moment. But who would like to take that first? Any thoughts on the cost effectiveness of screening? Andre.
I'm happy to take it first, because Mark, really, what a privilege to hear those remarks and to have your insights. Of course, I agree. Just to add some of the points that are most relevant, yes, let's look at the data. We can't use emotional epidemiology to create this new epidemic of screening. There are very real harms to it. And at the minimum, we can look at the budget impact cost effectiveness dimension. When we look at what is the cost of a breast cancer screening program in a high income country, in fact, it's nearly the same cost as the overall treatment. So we have to start looking in countries where trade-offs are being made. Where are the high priorities? We see countries that are screening for breast cancer, screening women at the age of 40, 30, 20. Yes, we all say, in fact, when low and middle income countries, only about 10% are following even what we would consider high income country evidence-based guidelines. So I think we need to be very open and truthful about what is the real world impact of screening. The challenge is, again, the emotional dimension. A screening program is a very compelling public health outreach effort. And in cancer, where we're all desperate to detect it earlier, there is the sense of, let's just do it because we can. I do think, again, we have to think about the potential harms. I mean, we have many situations. I have a colleague who was working in Nigeria, great public health effort. Let's go ahead and try to do some screening program through an NGO. She ultimately was found to have abnormality, had a near mastectomy at 32 because of a benign lesion. So these are some of the real world consequences of screening programs. And also that has a potential threat to our cancer agenda. Because if we're advocating for major investments in screening and governments are looking at it and saying, okay, show me how many lives were really benefited by this program, we maybe detected 10 cancers at an earlier stage. That's not going to be compelling enough when we know that the treatment may in fact not be covered or may not be provided in a quality assured way. So the discussion does need to be level of refinement, and the work of Cochrane has been so important.
Fantastic. Yeah, excellent. David, I think you raised your hands there. Do you have some thoughts on this?
Well,
and I'm going to Christina does as well.
Obviously, Mark and his colleagues have done wonderful work, and it's very sensible to say we don't waste money on things which don't work. But the pursuit of economic efficiency, cost effectiveness in a wicked world, it can itself be distorted. If we're not measuring what we really want, then the pursuit of efficiency can be just cost cutting. It can be denying the vulnerable or ordinary people what they really want, like personal contact with a doctor. And you say you're doing it for cost effectiveness reasons. All I'm saying is you've got to be very careful of this. You can also go on gathering evidence too long. When it becomes reasonable, you do something. In industry, as I've known, when people want to kill a project, they say, show us the evidence, and then they say it again and again. So be very careful with all this. If there's a common sense reason for doing stuff and there's enough evidence on the ground, you don't have to employ more academics to churn it over again and again. There is perversion and corruption everywhere, and that includes in the world of cost effectiveness analysis and meta review.
Great, thank you. Christina, I think you had a point, and then I'll come to you as well, Ruma.
I think that Mark raises a really great question that can be really emphasizes 2 points. One is the who gets screened, and then two, what we've been talking about in the delivery of healthcare. How do we deliver the screening? So lung cancer screening is a little bit unique in the screening world because it only screens those at highest risk. It is not an age-based screening program. It only screens those that have had a certain smoking history, et cetera, et cetera. And so, but yet having said that, the United States has had their screening up for a number of years now. And the most recent data shows that it's only gotten a 15% uptake. And we, in Canada, we're a very early stage of our lung cancer screening program, but we've really thought about doing it differently. One, in how it's being delivered. I know in the UK, you've had some pilot programs having a screening bus that goes to the supermarkets and have had good data following that and really bringing the healthcare to the people, as we were talking about before. But also in Canada, in addition to exploring these, our screening is delivered in a program sense. So going back to Mark's point about prevention or changing lifestyle factors, in Canada, what happens with the lung cancer screening is that when you are identified as a screening candidate, then you're referred to the screening center, and then they take it away from there. You're only screened for 3 years, and you leave the screening center with your 3 years worth of appointments. They remind you, and then you also, if you so should choose, have access to smoking cessation counseling. So really, it's a package approach as opposed to a opportunistic approach.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Christina. And Ruma, do you have views on this?
Yes, so an excellent question by Mark, and I would like to second the point which David made, that we already have enough evidence, no point of churning out that what needs to be done ahead. Well, the point what Mark made, that our clinicians focusing more on screening as compared to prevention and other forms of early diagnosis. Well, I feel it's a combined effort. Like being a clinician myself, I've been actively involved in advocacy of oral cancer and lung cancer, and it's not a one-stage process. We require reinforcement of advocacy. If I see a patient with early signs of radiolucency in his in the chest X-ray or white spots in his mouth, and to convince the particular patient that this particular lesion is going to turn out into a full-blown form of cancer, I feel the clinician would be needing the support of the whole of the health system, not only the clinician himself, the civil society organizations. What is the support from the health systems, not only like in the form of frontline workers? What is the support available to that particular suspect? So it's actually a vicious cycle and a whole array of stakeholders who would be involved in the prevention of that particular disease, in combination with reinforcement of that advocacy. So just with putting this onus only on the clinicians would be of little help, but making each stakeholder accountable would be the right strategy, I would say.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you very much indeed. And moving swiftly on to our next question, I think we've got David Bates lined up. Again, David, if you can explain where you are, and I think you may be directing your question to Ruma, but maybe to the whole panel. But David, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yeah, my name's David Bates. I'm a lecturer practitioner at Cumbria University, specialising in humanitarian action and disaster response. My question's about big data, because I was at a meeting a few years ago, and there was a representative from Macmillan Cancer here in UK there, and was talking about some of the really good work that they've been doing as a charity and as an NGO by taking big data. And I know you mentioned AI and meta-analysis, Ruma, earlier. And I was just wondering whether there's the technology and the capacity available globally to exploit big data the way Macmillan have been doing. And I'm sure it's not only in the UK, but also regionally and probably globally as well. But not being a statistician, I don't really understand this stuff. So I just wondered whether you had any views on that and whether there are any practical examples of where it's happening globally.
Right. Thanks, David, for that question. In fact, it's very relevant to the low and middle income countries. So I would say your question would be like divided into two parts. First of all, if data is available, is it consumable for the technologies what we have? So every health system churns out huge amount of data. First of all, like I'll give you an example from the National Digital Health Mission, what the government of India has launched recently. So that's the flagship initiative wherein each health ID of the patient would be created, each health record would be created, and that data can be consumed by any of the technology which can be harnessed, and with respect to a particular disease, that particular data could be analyzed. The second part, I would say that to leverage this data for artificial intelligence is a different scenario altogether, because to develop algorithms for a particular setting, that is particular region, particular country, that would vary from place to place, because we cannot be applying the algorithm what we have developed from the data of country A to country B, because the genetics would change, the risk factors would change, the other lifestyle changes would be different. So I would say that for the low and middle income countries, it would take time, because the data to be digitized, that would take time, and then subsequently to build algorithms for that particular population, for a particular disease, and that data to be relevant and accurate, that is going to take time. But yes, the process has begun.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Do other participants have, panelists have views? We've got one or two other. Yeah, Andre, please. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, just one brief comment for the technologies where we see great potential emerging that would be globally relevant, as we heard from Rima as well. Pathology, so automated review of pathology. We've seen it in cervical cancer with visible lesions. Now we're seeing the feasibility of histopathology and cytology. The technology is emerging. I wouldn't propose it's going to be available in the immediate future, but a worthwhile technology given huge gaps that we have in diagnostics capacity in cancer.
Great, thanks very much. I think we're going to have time for at least a couple more questions. So audience members, you might be able to squeeze an extra one in. I know that we've got two pending, and in fact, I think the next one is Megan. So Megan, would you like to come on and ask your question, please? I'd just like to unmute there.
Yes, yep. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Yeah, I think a lot of panelists did touch upon the topic of multi-stakeholder collaboration and how we really improve our partnership on the stern. Sorry, I have a baby in the background. Yeah, I'm just very curious about your thoughts about the role of the pharmaceutical industry and what role you think it can play to really advance, make an advancement in the early cancer care topic.
Fantastic. Thanks, Megan. So yeah, the role of the private pharmaceutical industry. Who would like to take that first? David, I'm sure you must have views. No, Christina. Christina had her hand up first. So if I can bring in Christina first.
Perhaps I can start, and I did take the liberty, Megan, of broadening your question a little bit further in what some of these partnerships can be in cancer care in general. And I would say in two parts. One is right at the clinical trial stage, pharmaceutical companies can really work with patient groups to highlight some of the value beyond what is sort of the traditional measurements of cancer and beyond the efficacy measurements. And those have that built right into the cancer cancer clinical trials. The second, I would say, is in the rollout. Many times pharmaceutical companies are really wonderful at bringing the drugs to market and really wonderful at getting it even through HTA. But perhaps what we can do is these sort of private community partnerships. We've seen that through COVID, where we've been able to take these and really roll out the vaccine very well. But how about commitments from the pharmaceutical company when we push something like, and when we try to get drugs reimbursed, we talk about things like performance-based outcomes and performance-based agreements. Well, could we perhaps work with policyholders and policy makers to really put another arm to this, equity-based outcomes and equity-based and measurements that perhaps pharmaceutical companies in getting listings can have extra points if their drugs are, or they have a plan that is going to address some of the inequities in cancer care.
Fantastic. And of course, health equity is such massive news worldwide at the moment, specifically around COVID vaccines and sort of big questions being asked about the performance of governments and the pharmaceutical industry in ensuring that vaccines really are allocated according to need, and perhaps suggesting that the way that contracts are worked out needs to be much more specific, just like you're describing there, about prioritizing equity in those types of discussions. So, David, I can see that you're unmuted. Do you have thoughts about this?
I was going to say that the only players in all this I take to be innocent are the people with cancer, that otherwise everybody's got vested interests, whether you're members of a professional group, whether you're governments, whether you're healthcare providers, whether you're pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies do a very good job in investing in late stage development research and marketing their products, and they have a good legitimate interest where the need for their products isn't revealed in helping to reveal that need. Clearly, it's an imperfect market. People often can't afford to pay when they're most in need. People don't have perfect knowledge. The pharmaceutical market is even more imperfect in some ways than the healthcare market, but it is heavily regulated in the Western world, and I think it works reasonably well. What we need is a little less pursuit of scapegoating. When you mention the talk on vaccines, to me, much of the claim that, oh, if we removed intellectual property, we'd open the way to vastly increased supply, was completely nonsensical. It was a form of scapegoating, as with HIV in a way before. We, as world communities, have sometimes been slow, especially in urgent situations, to recognize that sometimes very poor people need access to very sophisticated technologies. And we've been collectively slow. That's not to say the industry hasn't done as well as it could have done. It hasn't, but so is every other group. And I think what we do need to work together is logically to regulate each other, to release energy where we can in enterprise. And that's so important. How do we get ideas across the line to be useful products? It's profoundly difficult and not often appreciated that that's a form of innovation, separate from, but just as important as fundamental science. So I think there is good opportunity. Megan's right, but it's a difficult and complex world. And lots of us have vested interest, which cause us to have a very messy and sometimes unproductive debate.
Yeah, Andre. Thank you, David.
Those were very important points from David, also to not make this a messy and ugly debate. The one point to just add is looking at the pipeline. There's been a heavy emphasis, as David is mentioning, on late stage treatment. That's one concern, but of course that it's had its merit. Also looking at different formulations, different types of medicines that would be available in settings where cold chain isn't as reliable. There is a pipeline need that we should address in cancer that better reflects what the reality is in low and middle income countries, where supply chain is an issue, where diagnostics are an issue, where the disease states are different. So really looking at how do we set an R&D agenda that meets the needs of all people, not just those from high-income countries. Yes, there's a lot of investments in cancer, 40% of phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials, but all of them are so biased to high-income countries. Let's just try to remember the research needs for all stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. David, did you want to come back in there? I could see
Very
your hand
quick
flash up.
point, Andrew, and of course, I think we're agreeing about much, but so often late stage treatments doing research ultimately end up early stage treatments. Take the history of statins, take the history of cardiovascular. We've been a disgrace in not making low-dose antihypertensives and statins more universally available as preventives, but they started off as cutting-edge stuff. Mm-hmm. In cancer, what we're in the historical process of doing is unpacking the biology, understanding the disease, root cause, fundamental nature. Ultimately, that will lead to early stage and preventive treatments of value. But if we don't go where we've got the research opportunity, we're not going to get there. We're just going to say we want to do something, but we don't know how to do it. So my feeling would be at the moment where we should be focusing on is where we can, taking late stage cancer treatments and making sure that we're using them early enough and for the wide enough reasons, not locking ourselves in vested interests. Sometimes medicine itself really acts to slow the rate of development. We need high-level strategic policy making again, not the sort of reasoning which says prevention in the early stages, treatment is good, therefore we won't investigate and really understand the condition we're dealing with.
Great, thank you. And Ruma, did you have thoughts? Would you like to come in at all?
Yes, so I'll answer the question like how can World Economic Forum help in early stage cancer for the biopharmaceutical industries. I feel regulation is one of the key areas where the industry faces issues while entering some of the markets. So if I talk about India, it's a very difficult market for the biopharmaceutical industry. So what we at the forum do is that we build up an institutional culture, bringing on these stakeholders, connecting the biopharmaceutical industry's particular recommendations, brainstorming it with the relevant stakeholders and giving the policy recommendations to the government. So that's the strategy what we follow. In fact, in cancer, that's what we are doing. Also, not only that, again, I would like to focus on my point of technology. What we are also working on at present is that how technology can complement the biopharmaceutical industry, not only in enhancing the time what a particular clinical drug trial takes, and but also to bringing down the cost. So those are the work what the World Economic Forum is doing at present.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Now, I've just got one last question. So I've tallied up all the questions from the audience. And this is actually from my colleague who's interested in the risk factors. Maybe I sort of direct this to Andre, actually. One sort of knows the terrible risk factors associated with tobacco, but you mentioned a couple of other areas there about physical inactivity and alcohol in particular. Where do you sort of see these sort of figuring in terms of the greatest risk factors that we should be concentrating on in our promotion and prevention strategies at the moment?
Thanks. It's a great question. Just for the sake of time, I won't go into regional variation in too much. If we look at it from a global level, about 20% to 20%. So without a doubt, tobacco has to be a primary focus in the cancer agenda. The next one is infections as a group. That's about 13%. When you break down infection, it's a variety. H. pylori is about 3 to 8%. HPV is about 4%. So you can really, hepatitis, of course, is another important one. Of that 13%, you have some primary infections, but a variety using different approaches. Then is where you get to the variety of what would be considered high-income country biased risk factors. Obesity, 5 to 8%, depending on what estimates you use. Alcohol, 5 to 9%, depending on what estimates you use. And linked to obesity, physical inactivity as its own independent risk factor, but of course has a link to obesity. Environmental carcinogens, very real, about 3 to 5%. We do think environmental let's say air pollution as an aggregate is something that is becoming much more real. We're seeing it in countries like India, where as high as 5+%, and that will likely continue to grow. So how do we approach it? Well, there's a variety, as we know, policy dimensions, clinical interface, and looking at those underlying social determinants. What we're fearing is that it's going to be increasingly the most vulnerable groups that are exposed to the most risk factors. Traditionally, it has been the privileged, the higher socioeconomic groups, but that's starting to shift now as we look at the cascade of risk factors.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And I think what you're touching upon there is the social determinants of health as well. That our last London Global Cancer Week, that we were looking specifically at air quality, air pollution on cancer, and really quite astonishing figures. The figure I often hear mentioned is that air pollution causes 10,000 premature deaths in London alone, one city, and obviously one relates that to the big climate emergency debate that's been going on in Glasgow recently. So I think that really does illustrate that a lot of what we're talking about is around the roles of prevention, promotion, and the debate within the health sector. But so many of these things are much bigger than what we might regard as the typical health sector, and take you into the social determinants of health, the way that you run societies, the way that you organize cities. And we in the health sector are sometimes not very good at that, in sort of talking to economists and politicians and society sort of more at large. And we're delighted to have this opportunity to broaden out these discussions in events like this, and very much see it as our purpose at the Centre for Universal Health to have these discussions. I can see we've actually ticked over the hour, and I'm always getting into trouble for just assuming that people have got sort of limitless time for these discussions. So we are going to wrap it up there. We've mentioned the importance of other factors. Very much encourage people to get up and walk around. I hear that smoking, sort of sitting is the new smoking, I think is the slogan they use about physical inactivity. So I hope wherever you are that you've enjoyed our discussions today. Many thanks for MSD for supporting us in this work, and we look forward to working with you and colleagues and to the next London Global Cancer Week next year. But until then, thank you very much indeed, and best wishes to you all. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.